I'm not going to be saying a great deal here this evening because I feel there's a great deal of work upstairs, which says more than I would like to say here. And I'd rather the time was spent upstairs than down here. But having said that, I thought perhaps I would this evening give some indication of the meaning of the title of the exhibition, Fortuna, which was a title that arose out of the work that the curator Lilian Tonne and I did in selecting the work and in trying to work out what the strategy for the exhibition would be. And we thought that a lot of the exhibitions which have been done in the past are very clean and precise and show the drawings and the films which you can see upstairs, many films and many drawings, and give a good indication of the final work that comes out of the studio. But what very few exhibitions that I've been involved with have done have tried to give a sense of what happens inside the studio. And that was the kind of the heart of what we tried to achieve in the exhibition, particularly in the first two rooms, which we call the rooms of excess. They are rooms of excess in the way that a studio is a place of excess. There is always more than is needed, more than can be used, more than can be accommodated. So in the studio where the work happens, there is always the previous work, the current work, sketches towards the next work, and there is an open space for images to migrate from one project to another, to migrate from one medium to another. So something that starts out as a small etching can then spark the idea for a larger drawing of a similar image, which can then turn itself into a piece of sculpture, which can then be used in a piece of theater. And it's this this fury of different things being unstable and allowing themselves to move from form to form, from medium to medium, that the rooms of excess refer to. Fortuna itself refers to what happens in the studio. And the studio is best understood as both the physical space but also the metaphoric space that is a safe space for stupidity, a safe space for not knowing what you're doing, for doubts to have their space, for failure to be accommodated, for indecision to have an area in which it is not critically judged. Because a lot of the work, most of the work, and the work that's in the end is the pieces that I'm interested in and very often other viewers are interested in, is work that's not random. It's not as if anything can happen in the studio, as if it's pure chance. You throw up a stick and where it lands, that's the work. It's not pure chance, but neither is it something planned in advance. It's not a program which is being carried out and followed. It's not as if there is a script or a storyboard to the films that are made. And this space that is neither chance on the one hand nor program on the other, that gap in between is the space in which the work happens and the space which the studio protects. And this has to do with believing in other intelligences, in impulses that we're not aware of having until we suddenly see them on the sheet of paper, on both having an impulse behind a drawing, but then seeing what the drawing itself suggests as it comes back to you, this going backwards and forwards, so that as an artist, you're always caught between being someone who's making and someone who's looking at what's being made, artist as viewer and artist as maker. And that movement between the one to the other is also would be encompassed in the term Fortuna. So that you start with a very clear idea, perhaps, an image you think I want to make, but as it emerges on the sheet of paper, something else happened. It suggests other impulses, other ideas, other images which could be done afterwards, which could follow it. And in the films that are made, very often that's the strategy in which the films are made. There's a first image, and that first image, whether it's Soho on the beach or it's a man having coffee, will suggest a second image which gets drawn. And then the two images together start having a pressure of which comes first, which comes second. And through this pressure, a narrative starts to emerge. And that's the strategy of the studio. And to an extent, it's what we've tried to do in the shaping of the exhibition, particularly in the first two rooms, the rooms of excess. But I thought what I would talk about, almost as an example of this tonight, would be to talk a bit about the sound and the way the sound or the music works in the project, as there is a lot of sound in the exhibition. A lot of it written by Philip Miller, a Johannesburg composer, but a lot of it found from other sources. And I thought I would really talk about one project which is not on the exhibition, but which is maybe an interesting way of understanding the origin and the way in which sound starts to work with the images. I mean, the question of music or sound and image is a long-standing one, because on the one hand you have the very specificness of an image. Here is a drawing of a tree. Here is a drawing of a landscape. And then you have the very indeterminacy of music, something that could evoke many, many different things, that could have many different meanings. And this combination of the specificness of the image and the indeterminacy of sound is what makes this combination of the two so endlessly fascinating. Now, some years ago, I was asked to do a project at an opera house, at La Fenice Opera House in Venice. But I was not asked to do an opera. What I was asked to do as part of an ongoing series of projects which many artists did was to do a projection on the fire curtain of the theater, which is to say a projection that would happen in the theater while the audience was coming in and while the orchestra was tuning up. And my impulse was, and I wrote back to them saying, this is a foolish, impossible idea. Firstly, you have an audience that's not paying attention, that has not come to watch this, that has come for another purpose, and you're giving them a series of extraneous images which are just an annoyance. Secondly, you can't control the sound. It's whatever the orchestra happens to be tuning up and doing while this happens. And I politely declined to do the project. But my refusal was refused in its turn. And they said, I know it's a stupid project and it can't work, but why don't you try? Let's see what happens. So I thought, all right, I'll give it a week. I'll spend a week on the project because it can't work and I don't want to spend too much time on it. And I ended up spending 6 months working away on this project. And there was one starting point which was saying this is about an orchestra tuning up. So there was a starting point which had to do with something not precise. It's not a scored piece of music. And I thought it's also something that has to be able to work on a large scale of the opera house, and something that has to make sense in the context of the randomness of an orchestra tuning. And I started working on a series of images or possibilities of the chaos of an orchestra tuning up with the moment of coherence when the oboe plays the A and all the instruments of the orchestra follow and play the A, and then it disintegrates further. So I realized it became a project about trying to find coherence and incoherence, moments of coherence and then periods of incoherence. And to do this, I discovered I was starting on a series of sculptures which by and large are incoherent and have one moment of clarity. There's one example in the exhibition upstairs, which is the world on its hind legs in the room just upstairs. And there are other examples in the cafeteria, in the cafe, where there is a flat screen with various other drawings of these turning sculptures. So the first part of the project was making a series of sculptures, which we can start to look at. Let's start without the sound. So it worked on the principle of an anti-sculpture. I discovered I was making anti-sculptures. In other words, a sculpture is usually something which exists in three-dimensional and you observe it in the round. These were objects which were in three-dimension, the sculptures, the objects, but which only made sense, which were only comprehensible when they stopped being sculptures and became a flat image. So you would start with a series of planes, as you see over here, and there would be one moment when they would resolve itself. And I discovered that, in spite of myself, I was starting to be intrigued by a project which had to do with the fragile nature of coherence. That what we assume is a coherent world that we're seeing, in fact, is a coherence we ascribe to it, we construct onto the world from a whole series of completely incoherent and contradictory fragments that we see. And there is a moment when they come together and make sense. And then I started putting this together with sound of the orchestra tuning. Now, the particular sculpture that we're seeing here, the man, the nose on horseback, in fact is made of two elements. The element on the right is the three-dimensional sculpture, and the section on the left is simply its shadow. So here is a coherence which is only possible between an impossible object and its shadow having one moment when they come together to give a coherence. So the project, which had started out as an idea for a projection on a screen, had already migrated from the idea of projection into the work on it being the construction of sculptures, mainly made out of twigs and sticks and cardboard and wax, but in that case, in the end, turned into a cast of it. But most of them, as you can see, wire and paper, turning and shifting and transforming themselves, together with the sound of an orchestra tuning. The next stage of the project was the composer saying to me, well, do I know what opera they're actually going to be performing that night, or those days when they're projecting my film? And I spoke to someone at the opera, and they told me they thought they were doing Skiki, the Puccini opera. And I told Philip, and he said, all right, let's see what he could find from Skiki. And he came back with different fragments from it. But the piece that was by far the most intriguing was of a singer singing one of the arias. And he said it's a very bad recording. It's a very bad recording because, in fact, I asked Kimi Skota, the singer, who's a friend, to say if she knew anything from Skiki, and she said yes, she knew one aria. And he said, well, could she come into the studio and sing it? And she said, well, that's difficult because she was in Cape Town and he was in Johannesburg. That's like Sao Paulo and Rio, the distance between them. And he said, well, then could he just sing it into the telephone for her? So she started singing it into the cell phone. And he said, hang on. And he put his tape recorder on his piano and put his cell phone on speakerphone. So he played the piano in Johannesburg. She sang into the phone in Cape Town. And the recorder recorded it. And there was something so particular about the quality of that in fact that became part of the soundtrack. But then it needed an image to go with that soundtrack. So we've gone from the demands of the screen to the sculptures turning to wanting to develop it further to the strange singing to finding an image to go with the singing. So we'll jump to the end of the sculpture section of it. The project then started enlarging. We'd gone from the idea of a projection on the screen of the theater, and we'd then gone to a whole series of sculptures. So the studio is now full of these strange sculptures, these turning sculptures. And we had the music for the singing of the aria, and the number of screens and projectors started increasing. And I thought we've had turning sculpture as one kind of coherence and incoherence, the sculpture which is incoherent until it reaches one moment of fixed image that's recognizable. And then thought, well, are there other ways of shattering an image and reconfiguring it? So I started working with training paper, training thin shards of paper to move with the music. Let's see if we've got her singing further in here. Okay, that gives a sense of the... There was a third version which had to do with using water to shatter an image, projecting an image into water, disturbing the water so the coherence of the image was disturbed. And it became a trio of projections around it. And in the end, of course, the curators of the project connected to the Opera House said, well, what was the problem? It was obvious how it was going to work. So I have a great unease and uncertainty and mistrust of my own judgments in advance. My arguments were incontrovertible, I thought, about why the project could not possibly work, would be of no interest, and should be abandoned. And it was the work itself, the activity of making the works, plus the good kick from the curator, that enabled the whole project to happen. Now let's look at a very different kind of way of thinking about music and sound, of image and sound. There was an opera by Dmitri Shostakovich, The Nose, written in 1928, which I was asked to direct for an opera house. And one of the problems, one of the questions for this opera is how does one find a language that starts to work with the music of Shostakovich? And it's a very strange opera. It's got fantastic things in it. It has a section which is simply 2 minutes of percussion, nothing but percussion. So in some productions, they do it just on an empty stage. They just hear the percussionists playing. Sometimes it's done in the pitch dark, which I'm sure is fantastic. And what I'm showing you now is not something that was used all of it used in the final production, but was trying to say, let's take the music here as the given, this percussive interlude of Shostakovich, and see what kind of things are possible in it. So the first stage was, which was the horse that you saw, was simply trying to see, all right, would this image which was already made for the opera work with that music? Then there was a stage of trying the typewriter to see how could you find an equivalence between the typing and the percussion. And then the last piece, which we used quite a lot of in the end, was archival footage of Shostakovich playing not this percussive music at all, something that's actually quite lyrical but very fast, and seeing what it looked like if we put this image together with the music, to see if in the end we could turn what he was playing as if he's playing the percussion with his hands, if the piano was turned into all the drums. So I'll just jump to... It's a kind of astonishing piece of music in the middle of the opera. They have to employ 9 extra percussionists in the orchestra to play the music. So that was one piece which started with the Shostakovich and became that image, or the idea of putting together an image very different to the music that was actually originally went with the image, to put it together with it. Then there's a kind of reverse process of taking bits of Shostakovich's music and getting an actor to move with it, which I'm not sure if I have in its original form. No, but we have it in a different form. So this was an actor who was moving to Shostakovich's music, and then we reset it to music written by Philip Miller with a different group. And it was a Johannesburg actor doing a South African version of a Russian dance. And then this was taken, the idea of that dance with that music was taken another stage forward in thinking of the same kind of movements, but in this case, making them out of very crude paper cutouts. So that's, I mean, there we've got a further transformation, the idea of starting with the Shostakovich music, trying to find the archival image that would work with it, trying to work with a live actor working with the Shostakovich music, taking the movement we've then found from the Shostakovich music and seeing what that does with a very different kind of music, and then taking that image away and putting a different image again with it. Those kinds of moves. And so in the exhibition upstairs, there are many cases where you'll see the same image repeated in different iterations. Something you will see a series of sculptures just above where I'm standing now on the shelf. And those sculptures started off as torn paper silhouettes, a bit like the figure that we were looking at just now, that got turned into cardboard cutouts with wax added that became bronze sculptures. From those sculptures came the idea of the big lino cuts. So the sculptures predated the big lino cuts of the man with the tree and the woman with the telephone. It's that kind of transformation that is essential in the studio and that the studio protects. I think I'm going to show you one more example, and then I'm much more interested in the questions you have and to take the discussion from there. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. There are many examples. Just as one other kind of work, how the live performance ends up, what happens when you're actually watching it on stage, I'm going to show a fragment that started with the idea of metronomes beating together and out of time, as is shown in the screen upstairs. So the little video that is on the flat screen in the room just upstairs here was the starting point. And the version on stage with performers and projections is the development and extension of what was seen there. It's a short fragment from a performance piece which we're performing at the moment, which is called Refuse the Hour, which was a companion piece to the project done at Documenta this year in Kassel. And what we really had were the metronomes, projections of metronomes, and what you see the performers doing was a series of improvisations on top of those projections. Sorry for the sound. Let's go back. Good. I'm at this stage very happy to answer any more questions, any questions you have, not necessarily about this, but about the exhibition or other matters. Maybe we can put some lights on also. And I have a headphone here so that you can ask questions in Portuguese, and I will, with the assistance of our kind translators, be able to understand. Can we put some lights on at the back? Lights, lumière. More? Thank you. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'd like you to comment on there's lots of things that you use images that are related to the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay. Let me just pause for 1 minute. We need you to use a microphone for the translators to be able to hear you. Thank you. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you about the symbolic meaning of many things that he uses related to the beginning of the 20th century, like the speakers and it happens very often, so I think there is an attachment that you have with those things.
I think there are, so this is a question about obsolete technologies which appear in many of the drawings. For example, the big megaphone horns which are very present. Let it be said today, walking or moving along the beachfront, Ipanema to Copacabana, there were 3 times different trucks that went past with megaphones on them, square, not round, but megaphones like that, blasting out, I'm not sure what, advertisements, instructions, offers. So maybe some elements of the form have changed, but the technology is very often the same. That's the one thing. But the other is that what we have now in the world very often is an invisible technology. So if one has to think of the messages that come into all of us every day, whether it's cell phone messages or Twitter or Facebook or things that come on the internet and email, as well as an ordinary telephone line, there are dozens of lines coming into us all the time in the day. It's a common phenomenon. But those lines happen to be invisible. If you think of a telephone switchboard from 1915, say, you would have a person sitting with headphones in front of a console and different holes in front of them, and they would take a wire from one call as it was made and plug it into the corresponding number. And there was a physical, mechanical connection between the process, one person connecting to another, and what was made in the world. So there are 2 things. On the one hand, it's a drawing. A line being taken from a telephone switchboard is already a line in the world. It's a human-made line. In this case, it's a 3-dimensional line, but it's that line that's there. But more than that, what it does is it makes visible something that we know but we can't see. Those lines of contact, all those messages. If one had to draw those lines that come into one, we would all be like Saint Sebastian. There'd be so many arrows coming into us daily. So there are ways in which mechanical technologies, a bicycle wheel, for example, is something that we can see and understand the logic of, and I think that's the attraction for me in the things, rather than a nostalgia from 1920s telephone exchanges. There are also certain things that in a way existed for, say, 4 decades or 6 decades without changing fundamentally, an old-fashioned shape of a telephone. Whereas if you're drawing a cell phone now, essentially what you're drawing is you're drawing fashion. You're drawing fashion and change. Is this a cell phone from 2004 or a cell phone from 2007 or from 1999? It becomes very specific. So that's another, I think, reason why it is. And the third thing has to do with the particular materials. If you think of an old telephone made out of bakelite, there's something in the very blackness of the object, an old typewriter, which is already meeting a charcoal drawing halfway. It's inviting the charcoal to draw through its very blackness, its matteness, its form. So, sorry, a long answer for a clear question. It's not compulsory. There's one question at the back.
When you combine sound with image, you have a particular preference for a particular repertoire, or some composers are more important than others?
No, there are certain kinds of music that works particularly with animation. The way the sound works, which I haven't really shown in the charcoal animations here, they're all visible in the screens upstairs. But there is certain music, if you play it with the animation is unwatchable. It is so jerky and incoherent. And there is other music that somehow changes what your eye sees. It makes the images smoother. You feel the logic of something unfolding. And that very often has to do with a slow rhythm that is continuing behind the primary line of the music. And so very often there are you put any romantic string quartet with a piece of animation and it will always work. There's something about the strange rhythms and slow rhythms of what the cello is doing behind the viola and the 2 violins. So I was aware of that as a danger, and I've used that to some extent in some films, but tried to move away from that also. In terms of no, I mean, there are films made with Monteverdi, and there are films made with Mozart, or the opera made with Mozart and Shostakovich, and there's films made with Franco, the great Congolese popular musician. So there is quite a wide range, but it always has to do with what happens when one listens to that music with the image. So an early stage of working with the composer and the editor is looking at the first set of images and listening to different things with it and seeing what it tells us about the images.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Josh.
About the relationship.
Just wait for the microphone for the translator.
How do you see the relationship between maybe self-portraiture is the wrong term, maybe you could utilize another terminology, and performance, or performativity and self-portraiture?
I think, okay, it's a hard question because I've not thought of it in those terms, but it's a completely fair question about. I think perhaps the way to talk about it is in a set of, again, just something that can be looked at in the exhibition, a set of 8 etchings of Ubu from the Ubu series. Now, there's the big projection of Ubu Tells the Truth in the first room on the left when you come in. And in the first room of Excess, the wooden paneled room, there are these 8 etchings. And it was a project that started as etchings, had a stage when it became a piece of theatre, and out of the theatre came the video projections which are in the room. So the main piece, which was the stage performance, is invisible in this exhibition. But to do the Ubu prints, I needed to have an image which both referred to Jarry's way of drawing Ubu and also to something that wasn't just Jarry. So I thought I would use a mixture of quite crude white chalk drawings that look like Jarry's drawings. Let me just open up here again and I'll show you what we mean. So here you can see the figure of Ubu as that very crude chalk drawing, sort of. But for the other figure, I thought I would do a much rougher, kind of more fleshy, less schematic human figure and overlay the two on top of them. And to do that, I needed a model. And it was much easier to use myself than to hire someone else. And there are a series of embarrassing photographs in the catalog that Lillian made, which people from my studio sent. I was not aware of it until I saw the proofs of it, of the images used, which I used as the reference for doing these images. And they're of me riding a bicycle, they're of me beating myself, they're of me taking a shower, there's kind of crazy dances. And these were all possible because I did not think of them as myself at all. These were performances. This was like self-portraiture in the third person. I was being Ubu. Even though in the end they were photographs of myself, in a strange way, the set of etchings become a displaced self-portrait. So there are times when they have that big displacement. And even when it's more recognizably me, say, for example, in the flip book, How I Did Not Become a Minister of State, that was made for this exhibition. It's obviously very the same clothes, and me walking up and down, and based on a video that I took of myself to know what the image looked like of someone walking. But again, it's a self-portrait in the third person. So there is a relationship. There's definitely a relationship. And the thing about performance is that it, of necessity, goes into the third person. Giving a lecture here, standing here, hovers at the edge between just being here talking straight and performing, giving a lecture to you. So we're still on the safe side of it here, of just talking, but it could easily expand out and become a performance of what it is to give a lecture. Thank you. Yes, Lillian.
Could you talk about the origins of the image of the world?
On its hind, the world on its hind legs.
Yes.
Okay, so the image which Lillian is referring to is, I think there are 9 or 10 manifestations of it in the exhibition. It's an image of the globe, the circle, and that is on pylons that are walking. So it's, for shorthand, we refer to it the world on its hind legs. And it exists as a sculpture that disintegrates and reforms itself. It exists as an etching and then a large drawing and then a reproduction of the drawing in an Italian newspaper. I think it starts in one of the rooms of excess of a circular image, which is people walking around and inside of a globe. So it started as an image of procession of people on the world, and then at a certain point the procession was taken out and you were left with the other term of the equation, just the world itself taking its walk. But I think it first appeared in the video, the circular anamorphic video of What Will Come Has Already Come at the top of the stairs over here. It's one of the things that first appeared as one image and then kept on reappearing. I think it partly had to do with taking a different view of Cézanne's description, saying that you could describe all of the universe really with a cone, a sphere, and a cube. And this would say, all right, let's take the sphere and describe it as not just a formal sphere, but a sphere that has meaning as well. And the megaphone is the cone of Cézanne. So it's the shape of the cone, but again, it's saying not simply the pure form, but the form imbued with signification. And it's also like the constructivist images of the red square and the wedge, the red wedge defeats the white circle. So those suprematist and constructivist, very formal minimalist images are saying, let's take that language and allow it to inhabit the world. I think we should rather look at the works upstairs. Thank you all very much. Thank you.